There is a rectangular pit of hand-cut granite in Brooklyn, dug before the Civil War, still holding East River water. Film trucks now park at its rim. Nothing floats in it. 5,000 miles away, two battleships sit within sight of each other at Pearl Harbor. One a sunken grave, one a museum deck where Japan surrendered. Both were born in this same Brooklyn water. 70,000 people once worked here, 3 shifts a day. Then one announcement ended 165 years, and America sold the whole yard for less than the cost of a single warship. Why? Before the Navy owned this ground, it was a killing field. During the Revolution, British prison ships were moored in Wallabout Bay, and as many as 11,500 American prisoners died aboard them. That figure is traditional and contested. The bones were not. They kept surfacing along this shoreline for decades, and in 1908 the city finally raised a 149-foot column over what was left of them in Fort Greene Park, close enough to see the yard from its steps. The federal government bought the bay in 1801, taking the land from a Brooklyn shipbuilder named John Jackson, for a price usually given as around $40,000. The reasons were physical. Wallabout Bay is a sheltered curve of the East River, deep, protected, slow to ice. But the real asset stood on the other side of the fence, the largest pool of skilled labor in North America, a ferry ride away. That was the advantage. It was also the trap. They built into it like they meant to stay. The Commandant's house went up in 1806 and is still standing today, a National Historic Landmark with somebody living inside it. In 1829, the magazine aboard the receiving ship Fulton exploded at her own pier and killed roughly 24 men, though the exact count varies by source. The yard was lethal before it was famous. It was also ambitious. Matthew C. Perry, the officer who would later force Japan open to American trade, founded the U.S. Naval Lyceum here in 1833, and by most accounts commanded the yard in the early 1840s. Remember that. It comes back. Then came the granite. Between roughly 1841 and 1851, workers cut and set an entire dry dock out of stone by hand, a graving basin deep enough to hold a ship of the line. Dry Dock 1 was the yard's commitment made permanent. It was also the moment the boundaries locked. Brooklyn was already thickening around the wall. Tenements, streets, a produce market, a city with no intention of moving. The dock could never be relocated. Neither could anything else. What came out of that water began rewriting the country. On a November afternoon in 1889, the battleship Maine slid into Wallabout Bay. 9 years later, she blew apart in Havana Harbor, and the United States had a war. Nobody agrees on how much this place produced. One standard history credits the yard with more than 80 warships and hundreds of smaller vessels. The Navy's own historians say more than 160. The records have never been reconciled. The yard had proven it could start a war. What arrived next would put 70,000 people inside that wall and make this the largest single industrial employer in New York City. On a June morning in 1915, a hull the length of 2 city blocks slid down the ways into Wallabout Bay. Her name was Arizona. 26 years later, she would settle into the mud at Pearl Harbor with more than 1,000 men still aboard, and this yard would explode with work because of it. The expansion for the Second World War was not polite. In 1941, the Navy demolished Wallabout Market, one of the largest food markets in the country, a Dutch-gabled complex of produce halls that had fed Brooklyn for half a century, simply because the yard needed the ground. In its place rose Building 77, 16 stories, roughly 1 million square feet, and deliberately built without windows. Windows were targets. The Navy did not want anyone looking in, and it did not want glass raining down on the machinery when the bombing started. The bombing never came. The workers did. By the peak, something near 70,000 people were inside that wall, running 3 shifts around the clock. The gates on Flushing Avenue swallowed them before sunrise and emptied them out in waves. The yard had its own hospital, its own fire department, its own power plant, its own rail spurs threading between the shops. Fathers and sons worked the same hulls in the same trades. Boilermakers, shipfitters, riggers, electricians. Vinegar Hill, Fort Greene, and Wallabout arranged their entire lives around a federal paycheck that had not stopped once in 140 years. Demand outran the available men, so for the first time in the yard's history, women went through the gate in welding hoods. They burned steel, ran machines, and worked hulls that would sail into the Pacific. The Navy Yard's own archive holds their recorded voices. Most of the country still only knows them as a poster. The output is the part that stops you. North Carolina, launched 1940. Iowa, 1942. And on a January day in 1944, the battleship Missouri went into the water at Brooklyn. On the 2nd of September 1945, Japanese officials signed the surrender on her deck. Take a second with that. The officer who once ran this yard forced Japan open in the 1850s. The ship whose destruction dragged America into the war was launched here in 1915. The ship where that war formally ended was launched here in 1944. Same bay, same granite. Today, Arizona and Missouri sit within sight of each other in Pearl Harbor, and almost nobody standing between them knows they came from Brooklyn. Peace should have finished the place. It didn't. The Cold War refilled it. Between 1955 and 1960, the yard launched 3 supercarriers, Saratoga, Independence, and Constellation, the largest warships America had ever built. Not a decaying relic, not a museum, a yard operating at the outer edge of what heavy industry could do. Outside the gate, Sand Street ran on shift change. Lunch counters, bars, pawn shops, boarding houses, payday traffic. Launch days brought crowds onto the ways to watch a hull the size of a building drop into a river. And inside the Pentagon, planners were already writing the yard off. The next generation of nuclear carriers would need docks Brooklyn didn't have and room Brooklyn couldn't get. The city that supplied the labor had sealed the yard inside itself. Land was too valuable. Wages were too high. Gulf Coast yards were cheaper. By 1960, this looked like the most permanent industrial site in New York. That was the dangerous part. On the 19th of December that year, inside the carrier Constellation, a forklift punched through a fuel tank. The fuel poured down through the decks onto welders working below. It ignited. The fire burned for hours inside a steel hull with limited ways out, and when it was finally over, 50 men were dead, most of them civilian shipfitters and outfitters, not sailors. The injury count depends on which file you open. 323 in the yard's own history, 150 in the Navy's. Damage ran around $75 million. The delay was 7 months or a year, again, depending on the record. Brooklyn's reputation never recovered. 4 years later, on the 19th of November 1964, 16 days after the presidential election, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara announced the closure of more than 90 military installations. The Brooklyn Navy Yard was the biggest name on the list. No enemy, no accident, no obsolescence anyone could see from the street. A cost analysis. New York fought it with everything it had. Mayor Robert Wagner, Senator Jacob Javits, Senator-elect Robert Kennedy, Brooklyn Congressman John Rooney. They lost. A Columbia industrial engineer, Seymour Melman, drew up a detailed plan to convert the yard into a commercial shipbuilding operation and save the skilled trades. It was never implemented. The city went looking for an automaker to take the site instead. Nobody came. The last ship, the amphibious transport dock Duluth, went into the water on the 14th of August, 1965. Duluth was towed to Philadelphia on the 2nd of February, 1966, to be finished, because Brooklyn was closing. The yard could not complete its own final hull. On the 25th of June, 1966, the flag came down. 165 years ended. More than 9,000 workers walked out of a place that had held 70,000. Then came the sale. The figure is given as $22.4 million in one standard history, $24 million in others, and the year as 1966 or 1967, depending on the source. For 200 acres of New York waterfront, 6 dry docks, and the yard that built the Missouri, less than the price of a single warship. Reportedly, Washington then sat on the paperwork for roughly 18 months while the ground stood empty, and leases were being signed inside the fence before the city legally owned it. The Second Life failed, too. Seatrain Shipbuilding laid off 3,250 workers in 1975 and was gone by the end of the decade. What happened to the buildings is the part that stays with you. Admiral's Row, a line of 19th century officers' houses, was left behind the fence for roughly 40 years. Roofs caved, trees grew up through the parlors. After a long preservation fight, most of it was demolished in the 2010s. A supermarket stands there now. The 1838 Naval Hospital is still boarded and rotting. The sailors' burial ground was emptied around 1926. The remains moved to Cypress Hills, and the empty ground reopened as a public memorial landscape with no graves in it. Building It got its windows cut open at last for a food hall. The yard today holds hundreds of businesses and more than 11,000 jobs, more people than the day the Navy locked the gate. Its revival required the Navy's failure. The 3 battleships born here survive as museums in North Carolina, California, and Hawaii. None in Brooklyn, which leaves the granite, cut by hand in the 1840s, still square, still full of East River water. The Missouri once sat in water like that. Now a truck idles at the rim, and the dock holds the shape of ships that are gone.